going. Oh, that's so cool. That
So
is
we're all
great.
getting all ex nihilo here.
We're brothers in nothing, in nothingness.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it'd be a good place to start then. How did that phrase come to you?
Well, it's funny because I think with all these things of how you present music in an album, it's always kind of imperfect. You know, I got a little bit of pushback from friends saying that the term the title Ex Nihilo would make it seem like a metal album.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, I don't know. That's not, because it's not really heavy metal, right? But I thought that, you know, but I'm a dramatic person, and there's just some drama in metal, and there's some drama and I do overlap with like gothy music. And
Sure.
the record has all this like what I intended as very epic sounding like opera singing. And you know, also at the time, that record Ex Nihilo, which was, I guess I finished it in like 2012, released 2013, something like this. It really started generating during the financial crisis, and which actually kind of freaked me out, and also because of my age, it really felt like, because I'd always done sort of ironic records. Really, there was a whole period there where a lot of my records were kind of funny. There would be these little vignettes, these sort of snarky commentary on social things, like and usually like an imaginary person that would be a bit of the person I would basically make fun of or something. And then I said, you know what, I think when the financial crisis happened, I was like, you know, it's time to get real here. And then I started looking at like my origins, you know, in music, and coming back actually to what I felt I was about in, you know, like 84, once I started getting rolling and making records. And so much was filtering through the recording studio in Brooklyn. That really I wasn't really representing in my own personal music, kind of on purpose. I needed to get away from some of the stuff. So I was doing stuff that was very intense and kind of noisy. You know, Sonic Youth and Swans, and even the Bill Laswell stuff had a sort of like world kind of intensity. I mean, we had like William Burroughs speaking on like an album. So, you know, and I felt like kind of pulling away from all that. So my own personal music was an escape. And I was like, you know what, I'm done escaping. This is kind of what I felt in like 2008, 2009. So let's get down to that, and let's get down to more of the essence. And Ex Nihilo, I think, I mean, the way I heard the term a lot was in sort of theological discussions in the Middle Ages, where the question was, did God create a universe from pre-existing matter, or from nothing?
From nothing.
So I mean, it's amazing. When I realized that, I thought it was pretty funny. There's like, wow, that people were getting into intense arguments about that, probably shaming each other even on various positions. But it's funny, something I never really considered at all when in all the talk about God and creation. But, you know, since I'm essentially also a nihilist, you know, I believe that meaning is sort of made. You know, if there is a God, God's kind of a nihilist, right? God invented the meaning. So if you believe in God, that's the perfect nihilism. He's like, oh, well, what should mean something? And then fucking makes it out of clay or something. And then goes, well, that's meaningful. You know, so
it's a very
there was no
point. But at the risk of sounding trite, you're certainly an artist. Are you creating art out of nothing?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is, and just for disclosures, I do feel like and we all have the benefit. Actually, that's a thing about human beings. It's like we have the benefit of learning, learning from each other, and also passing on knowledge. Right? That's actually what really separates us from, you know, other actually very intelligent species. Is they can be taught stuff, but they don't really learn from each other because of their communication skills. So a lot of what's there, I didn't invent opera, and I didn't invent what meaning you get from a woman, as there is on my album, going like singing like you know, like blood curdling kind of, like that has meaning to our ears, right? So certainly. That's from other things we draw on. So it's really but I do create something. I do create meaning from other like disparate meaning that's out there, and I cobble it together to find my own meaning. So it is definitely creative in a lot of ways. Certainly. And actually, I do think it is sort of like how creation really happens, which is a lot of accidents, right? it's a lot of
Definitely.
look at our own mutations. Without accidents, we'd be still back in the protozoa,
Right.
or maybe not even then.
Well, I guess I asked that question somewhat rhetorically because I feel like, of course, you can't create something out of nothing artistically. It's all coming from somewhere that you're piecing, especially in your line of work, right? You're piecing together so many things. But
Yeah.
in your personal music, when you're creating more experimental or avant-garde, is it? I'm sure it's harder to place exactly where you're pulling it from. It's right.
Yeah. That's actually kind of what I said, that, when I came up with the title, it's sort of imperfect,
Yeah.
because I really do sort of find I mean, this sort of thing that we don't want to happen too much in our lives personally or politically, is I do find things and then explain them in retrospect. So but I do create, and of course that's not the way it's supposed to seem. It's supposed to seem like here's a cohesive
Right.
concept and the creativity, and it all seems to happen at once. And so it seems like that the narrative and the thing that you're listening to all are one and happened at once. But the truth is that I I look back, and then I kind of uh, then I ask myself, what am I trying to say here? And
Yeah.
like, for instance, my a solo record I had maybe 15 years ago, before the one before Ex Nihilo. It's called Sirens of the Apocalypse. It's funny because when I finally came up with the title, it tied everything together, because there was a lot of women in my little stories and vignettes, and I kind of realized they were all women for some reason that I don't know.
They
So,
always
but
are.
I didn't. Well, it's because I would be attracted to people, which in my case
Yeah.
is women, or
Yeah.
women identifying. And then I was like, so all this social critique was filtered through critique and commentary, where there was all characters in it. And so then, but I couldn't tie it all together. It wasn't even deliberate. It's all going to be women. But then when I looked, I was like, oh wow, it's all women. So maybe that should be said something in the title, or how I talk about this, because there's also subconsciously, there was a freaking reason. And it's funny because it took what it took to come up with that title, because I was pained about it. It was holding up everything, holding up the artwork. I was
Yeah.
pained about it. And I was hiking in Boulder, Colorado, and I was going up the Front Range over there by the Flatirons. I don't know if you're familiar with Boulder.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. It's my backyard. Yeah.
you're based in Denver?
I'm in Denver. Yeah.
Okay, well, there we go. So
Yeah.
I was in
Yeah.
in Colorado, hiking up because my daughter was um in Boulder at that
Okay.
point. So I had time. So I went hiking. So I'm way up in the Front Range there, or whatever, near the Flatirons. No one around, nothing. Couldn't hear sounds, and suddenly I hear one sound from below, from Boulder, which was some emergency vehicle and a siren, and that's the only thing I heard. And then suddenly, Sirens of the Apocalypse. Like, I just got it, and that was the album title. So,
That's
and then I
great.
realized, oh, it hits all the buttons, it ties everything in together. So anyway, so talking about like creativity and how it happens, and from nothing. I don't know how that tangent ties in, but the tangent is, for me, sometimes it's almost kind of retrospective, and I have to figure out, well, what, even like with Ex Nihilo, where I was sort of asking myself, well, where did I come from? Because I
Right.
was like, I could, in my view, almost like only partly conscious during my early 20s or late teens. I mean, I started the recording studio when I was 19 years old.
Right.
Um, Actually, New York City had so much happening at the time. It was it was
Yeah.
obvious. It was like so much happening, so much to talk about, that I forewent. I didn't go to college. I mean, I had intended to go to college, but it was so much happening. I was like, no, I got to dive into music. I got to dive into this thing. So all of this was very instinctual, not too, which is probably good, and for me, not, I didn't think it through too much. So, at now middle age, then I was like, oh, well, let me think about that a bit, and what filtered through me, and that's why. So that was part of the creation, was sort of like
That's
taking all these things.
fantastic. I think
And
I
then,
would have a hard time explaining why I related to the term myself. Very similar to you, I would say. At first glomming on to the religious aspect of it. Was there a
yeah.
God that created something out of nothing? I was obsessed with that as a kid.
Oh,
A-
wow.
Yeah, and I was obsessed with the idea of certain people, I think, and I still am, people like Stalin or Sonny Liston, people who can rewrite their pasts as if they never happened. You know, I'm fascinated by that idea of being able to manipulate one's own past.
Well, that was just like a minute ago, when I was slightly edging to, and I was saying of looking back and sort of trying to understand. It's also a bit of self-therapy, you know, um, to write a story. Also with, you know, just to be healthy, like kind of loving my young self, even though I regret many things, you know, loving my young self and writing a story. I mean, it's art. I can do whatever I want, and
Right.
I can you know, I'm not trying to say I'm about this, I'm about that. I put it in symbols with sounds and music, and you know, maybe have a
Yeah.
singer, someone other than me, maybe actually sing the things that I related to, but to capture the energy. That's why there's so much chaos and noise in on the record Ex Nihilo, because it's funny, that was the environment then. You know, New York in the 80s was, you know, dystopian, whatever that word means to you, right? It was kind of dystopian. We actually thought,
Yes.
I really thought there was no future. I mean, I was kind of in that cultural mode where I just thought, I didn't think things would come around to New York. I just thought that that was the urban environment. We kind of thought ourselves, I know this is a bad word now, but at the time I thought of ourselves as, you know, of course, nonviolent, but, you know, urban survivalists. That's the term that came out. We were sort of,
Yeah.
you know, sort of, you know, anarchist, making our own community, you know, kind of relying on the state, not that much. I mean, there was subways, there was like heat and electricity, but there wasn't, other than that, we were kind of relying on each other.
It
So
sounds
that
kind of
was,
hopeful in a certain way.
well, I was very optimistic, you know, mixed
Yeah.
with depression, but I was very optimistic. And and then also with, I guess, with the financial crisis, it felt like similar in some ways with the financial crisis, and you don't know where the bottom is, you know, how
Yeah.
far down it goes. And then we started talking a lot about collectivism, and some people did comment that there was more collective action, collectivism, um, that had sort of disappeared from the American landscape maybe after the 60s, right? So
Right.
during the whole Clinton era, there wasn't, you know, there was some, of course, it happened, but I'm just saying, emerging more into sort of the public, into the general politic of like collectivism. You had Occupy Wall Street, of course. You had more people um, speaking collectively, taking action collectively, planning collectively, and that was sort of not had been gone maybe for at least on that at that scale, right? For like 20
Yeah.
years, that's sort of been gone. And suddenly I found that again, which is sort of familiar. I mean, it was different. The sort of, you know, Occupy movement was kind of different, but it was familiar in that people talking
Sure.
to each other that weren't necessarily the best, you know, personal friends. You know, because you know,
Yes.
it is kind of funny looking back at the whole collective I was a part of. We weren't, you know, we didn't tell each other we loved each other. We were just planning. So it was sort of, you know, not strangers, but we were sort of, and also once we realized someone was interested in doing things musically, actually musically, and on the sort of same page with the same values, we didn't have to know them that well to like bring them into the community and record them, for instance, as we did.
No, I mean, I suppose not. It's interesting because, you know, what you kind of touched on there is it was familiar and yet different. And I'm kind of, in some ways, obsessed with this idea. You know, I feel, especially culturally, artistically, politically, I feel like we keep trying to go backwards, right? And I mean, I'm not the first to say this. People have been, you know, harping on this idea of nostalgia for a long time. And I
Yeah.
think I'm a little bit stuck on this idea of that. It seems like we keep going back. I mean, you know, Trump, for example, his big thing was make America great again. And I can't help but see Biden's election, as excited as people are, as a way of trying to go back to the Obama era and
Yeah, of course.
Occupy Wall Street, going back to the city. And of course, it's always slightly tweaked, right? Slightly different because it's impossible to go back. But we're so obsessed with it, aren't we?
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's a exact analysis.
Can I bring
Yeah.
up something else too? Because as I think about nostalgia, so I want, you know, nostalgia is, you know, that ancient definition of it from the original Greek. It's return to home, right? There's something so beautiful about that, returning to a home. And there's a reason why we keep going back. So when I was watching this documentary on you, The Sound and Chaos, um, I've never been to BC Studios. I've been to New York City long ago, never been to Brooklyn or very few parts of Brooklyn. There's something about the way that that studio is presented that just felt like home. It just felt like an amazing place to be. Maybe because so many musicians that I've admired have recorded there, and there's all these things started to click. Some of it though was your own personality. I just felt like you're a guy I've known my whole life for some reason. Just the way this stuff was presented, I felt like this is a place I want to be a part of. I got to see this thing thrive. Like, this is beautiful. There's something about it that just felt so exciting. And I think all of the artists who spoke about you in that studio in the documentary certainly felt the same way. There's a magic, isn't there, to BC Studios and to Gowanus?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think so. You know,
Yeah.
I don't officially believe in magic. You know, but you know, like but it does seem that the meaning we created was there. Also, I do think that there's one thing that I have noticed is how people are a little more blown away by the space when they walk into it, increasingly, because spaces like that are increasingly rare.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, maybe almost non-existent, except for almost non-existent, right? So coming into the space now, people are kind of blown away because they're not used to being in a space like that. The reality, though, is that people used to not be so blown away by my space because it was familiar, right? And when I started the space in I moved in 1979. Actually, already 1979, 1980, in that time was the whole movement of like repurposing abandoned industrial space. That was pretty much the thing. So it was kind of on a lot of income levels, you know. So you'd have rich people that immediately went conveniently just downtown Manhattan. So you had, you know, Soho, Tribeca, those areas that had, it's almost easy to forget now, but those were industrial areas in downtown Manhattan, and those were, like, in some cases, just abandoned buildings. And so they went in there, fixed them up, and I did not have that kind of funding with my group, which kind of went by the name Material, and they're Material Records. Yeah. So we found a space in Gowanus, Brooklyn, also an industrial area, and my building was not abandoned. In fact, there was a landlord and I signed a lease, but by all practical purposes, you would look at it and go, this looks abandoned, right? Because it's decrepit and falling apart. So we took a little space and fixed it up. But anyway, it was not that unfamiliar a kind of space. So I do think that, and by the way, I want to slip in that the era that I grew up in, that I came to in that era, nostalgia was a bad word. Nostalgic was a bad word. We'd use it disparagingly towards music that's trying to recapture something and not moving forward. So I never use the word nostalgia. I try to stay away from it because it's loaded for me. But I do find, for instance, I wouldn't say, hey, feel some nostalgia, come to my place. But the reality, though, is that there is a narrative, I think, from that era. And it does seem like I deal with what I would call kids, you know, young people, college age, that come here to record, for instance, that do feel that they're part of a sort of a cultural continuum that's just different from the mainstream, that does have its roots and has its elders and has its pantheon of people that they love, you know, whether it's Alan Vega in Suicide, or this kind of stuff. So it's like Iggy, for instance, is a part of that sort of proto-punk and stuff. So you know, and there's a general sense that you need to know your stuff. You need an education in these things musically and culturally to really participate now. So there really is a history. But you know, coming back to that moment where nostalgia was a bad word. So basically, I guess I'm saying that there's no shame in it. But I can see both sides. But specifically in 1980, 81, when I was sort of starting, was really an interesting moment of futurism in art. And interestingly enough, there was a sort of futurism in hip hop. So a lot of the people that I dealt with, I would refer to as Afrofuturists. I think I've heard that term around a bit. But so for instance, Afrika Bambaattaa, who, you know, was part of his narrative. He wouldn't even talk about global unity, right? I mean, he had an album called Planet Rock, right? Which, by the way, sampled a lot of Kraftwerk, which was a German. Right. You can't make this stuff up.
I know, it's nuts.
Which you know, sampled a lot of Kraftwerk, a krautrock German band. And that's called Planet Rock. Okay, but aside from Planet Rock, he would usually talk about like cosmic unity and stuff. And he would even, I'm not, whether he believes it or not, I don't know, but that was his narrative of like trying to unite all the planets and stuff like that. So he was, the idea was a sort of futurism. And that's why a lot of the hip hop kids, loved Kraftwerk and also graffiti people. Because I when I wrote graffiti in the 70s and, Kraftwerk, Trans Europe Express came out in 1977. I think I was on at least one train, tagging up in the train with someone with a boombox blasting Kraftwerk. The graffiti kids loved that. And also a lot of the kids that did the break dancing and stuff, they loved Kraftwerk and those kinds of rhythms. And so and all the mythology and the imagery of breakdancing has a sort of sci-fi futurism, the superheroes, all this business, right? So I'm saying that was a sort of a moment where and I came into that. So nostalgia would be like, no, man. Also, we were in this mode, which I basically retract. I do not think this anymore. We were in a very fuck the 60s kind of mode, which I don't subscribe to anymore. There was a lot of good, a lot of bad. Yeah, I would never generalize like that. But at the time, we were in that mode, right? Fuck the Woodstock generation. Think forward. None of this nostalgia. No folk revival. Move forward, and new sounds, right? A lot of that new sounds. Fuck traditional instruments. How about banging on some of the things that we have around us? Maybe we can walk around in this neighborhood and find some abandoned car, and then salvage some pieces of an engine, and that'll be like our percussion. So there was a very futurism thing. And it's funny because I got a comment because I had my 35, this came out like 4 years ago, the 35-year anniversary record, which is in 2 editions for the studio, right? So I did these 2 records that are, we made collectively like 50 participants. And for the 35-year anniversary of the recording studio, it's called BC 35. Anyway, so I was in Berlin, and I was talking to someone in Einstürzen der Neubauten because we did a bit of a Berlin record release show for the record. He was nice, but he was sort of like, he doesn't believe in looking back, And
is that a Blixa?
No, it wasn't Blixa. It was Jochen Arbeit.
Oh, okay.
Super sweet guy. Yeah, someone who's recorded here. That's why he was on the bill, right? He had a sort of experimental ensemble. And he also has another, it wasn't Automat, but he's got another thing called Automat. But it was this other thing. It was like an electric string quartet. Very, very cool. Very ambient. And, and I think also it's funny because I mentioned Kraftwerk and new sounds and Krautrock, and actually Neubauten was a part of that movement and very into new sounds, right? Also very needing to look forward because it was, we're talking West Berlin, right? It wasn't a whole lot of, we want to look backwards. What would they want to look backwards to? Certainly not pre-liberated West Berlin, and certainly not whatever like Deutschland kind of business. So there's nothing to look back to in their environment. So I might be taking that a little too far, but I think Neubauten was kind of more like looking forward. So he said that to me. So I guess I kind of see both points, but I think as you were sort of saying, it seems sort of impossible. And coming back to the ex nihilo concept, it really seems to be impossible to not have to create something free of any kind of reference points.
Right. Do you feel that musically and aesthetically time has stopped? That's another thing I've been thinking a lot about. I read this book by Mark Fisher, who was a philosopher. He wrote a book called Ghosts of My Life, a collection of his essays, in which he kind of postulates that, speaking specifically of musically, there's a time in which that futurism you spoke of stopped, and everything began to go backwards again. And what he was saying, he sums it up by just saying, if you take music of today and present it to somebody in 1995, they wouldn't be impressed at all. It would sound like everything that they were listening to in 95. Whereas if you took something from 95, transported it to 75, it would blow people's minds because of how unique it would sound. Do you think that's true? Or do you think he was oversimplifying it?
No, I unfortunately, it doesn't have to be that way, and it doesn't have to be that way moving forward. But Yes, at the moment, that I have a theory of what plays into that, but at the moment, yeah, um, it definitely seems that way. I think part of the reason, um, I mean, on the very basic level, there's the usual thing, right? We only have 12 notes, right? We only have certain time signatures that are going to work. Actually, we can expand a little from 12 notes, and there's also like Arabic scales that involve, and you can program a keyboard to do Arabic scales, right?
Wow.
In fact, the next keyboard I buy, I want to make sure can do that, because why wouldn't I want more notes? Why wouldn't I want 24? It's in an octave. Hey, of course, though, once you go there, it's like immediately tags it as Arabic sounding. So it's a little tough. Then that's an example. It's like only have 12 notes. And someone says, hey, here you can have 24 notes. And I'm like, oh, that's great. And now that's also another pigeonhole, right? But there's that, of course. But I think the bigger thing is I think we are really dependent on the instrument makers. I'm very aware of that. I mean, just look at rock and roll, where it basically electrified the blues, and therefore that's a new sound. And weirdly enough, I think that even as you were saying, as you were giving your point, it seemed to come down to sounds. It wasn't like someone from 1995 or 90 even listening to our stuff now and listening deeply and looking about what's being said or what the vocal treatment is or blah blah. It really has to do with sound. Like how would they be surprised by the instrumentation or the vibe, and they would maybe perceive it as a little amped up, but rock and roll really was like boom, and I think that a lot of that has to do with electrification. So none of those rock and roll innovators invented an electric guitar, made an electric guitar. So they relied on the instrument makers. I think there's kind of a lot of examples when, what would New Orleans jazz be without actually all those French instruments, right? They didn't make them. I don't think those probably were imported from France, actually, right? So the trumpet and the saxophone, blah, blah, blah. And so that's the sound, what would they have done without those things? So it's so much of what defines something, as we can say, like a whole new thing, involves the instruments themselves and the instrument maker. So it's a little tough. So we're sitting around here relying. That's why there's such a, and of course, by the way, the whole era of computerized music, that's why we see this completely different. Are there any of those beats, computerized beats, like actually clearly that different from the beats that were done before? I mean, yes, of course, there's variations. You can make them maybe busier or more complicated. But, if you want to go to town with a bunch of percussionists, you could make the same beats. It just would feel very different because it was not made by a computer and not made, but with samplers and triggers and stuff like that. But so, for instance, with the whole futurism of the Afrofuturism that you had in hip hop in the around 1980 in the late 70s was an excitement by all of them to because that was their liberation, from this urban marginalization that they had, was taking these modern instruments and making something that was new, that the rest of the mainstream wasn't doing, it, that they could do and make their own. And they were very excited for the instruments. Like I know some of the kids in the South Bronx, if they had a DMX drum machine, that was absolutely precious, right? And they were very excited about making these new sounds, and they were wrapped into this, I guess, a lot more futurism at that time. Sure. So right now, for instance, look at how basically these sort of boutique kind of DIY pedal makers, right? They make all these pedals, guitar pedals, effects pedals. That's people are hungry for them, right? Because because we're all sort of, honestly, we're all competing against each other, right? Like if I don't think about that, I'm just going to sound like the next person, right? With my experimental pedals. So I need new pedals and I need to combine them in different things. So we really rely on the instrument makers, on the pedal makers, if you will. So I think that's maybe, so here's my point. What I was saying is, I think right now there hasn't been a new injection of technology for a little while. Sometimes sort of, there's been tools for putting the stuff together, like home studios and stuff. We're already falling into people on like Ableton using just the stock sounds. In fact, that sometimes I critique my friends was like, I can tell that's a stock sound. I can tell that bass drum is just the same one as everyone else on the block. So in terms of like new instruments, there hasn't really been, and plus honestly, we've exploited a lot of the sort of make it yourself instruments, right? I mean, even now it's like, for me, it's actually nothing new to go out and find scrap metal. Sometimes we still do it here. I have a collection of scrap metal that people bang on sometimes, and sometimes it's like right on the money. But we've exploited and that a lot, and that's kind of done. That's already that era.
Where does this fearlessness come from in just exploring new sounds? I mean, so many people I think are just wrapped up in conventionalism that they'd be really afraid to try these things. Like listening to the Ex Nihilo record, I listened to it many times in the past week. It is experimental and a bit avant-garde, but yet it's so accessible too. I mean, it's an enjoyable record. I would highly recommend it to people. So the question is do you feel like it's a brave choice artistically to push these limits of conventionality?
Yeah, I mean, it's the only thing I know, right? So it for me, it makes total sense. I mean, if you're going to be brave, there's a lot of other occupations on the planet that require more bravery.
Right. That's why I qualified it by just saying artistically.
That said, I'm brave. It's a little funny, but it's all I know, and I do think it takes a certain bravery. What I find more confounding is I do get surprised with people that want to just make straight up traditional music. I could see if maybe that's a part of what they do, like on the side they have their Irish band or something like that. That I kind of get, like, especially if it's on the side, But in terms of people really trying to do something, and even saying, like, if I have an idea or something, that they'll say that for them, that's too out there. They want to do straight songwriting, They want to do straight songwriting, so that's too out there. That's too unconventional. So I have a hard time completely understanding the motivation there. So I have a hard time getting into that mindset. I think part of it might be people trying to make something with the focus on quality, which I sometimes think it's weird. I sometimes call it the tyranny of good, which is people are very concerned sometimes with making a good song, a good drum beat, well played, good lyrics, and then that sort of good singing, and then that they want to be known and put it out there of being a good singer and having skills, and that's important to them. And so then that's all leaning towards conventionality, I think, when you get too stuck into quality, or as I said, the tyranny of good.
So that's what's important to you?
I think, luckily, I think in Brooklyn, I think that the way I like to put it, it's not the whole enchilada, right? It's not what everyone does, but there generally is, like, if you look at Brooklyn media or whatever, their experimentalism is at a higher premium, I think, than a few places. It's just something, an aspect of things that when you have it, it's appreciated. I forgot your question, but I guess that's the end.
Well, I mean, because you're talking about how everybody wants to be good. They want the music to sound good. The singer wants to be good. I feel like those things are, understandable, right? Everybody likes to look good and sound good, et cetera, et cetera. So I wondered if that's not important to you. What is important to you?
Yeah.
So I was going to say that,
just to clarify, I didn't say that that's important to everyone. But right. I did say that I think that when some people are stuck into something more conventional, that might be one of the underlying things. So yeah, that's why I brought up Brooklyn media, is I'm actually a little like that I do take experimentalism and have it at a higher premium. But I gotta say is that it doesn't take much for me to feel positively about someone doing that. Sometimes it can be very little, because of what we said, is that it's hard. First of all, I am a bit of a sucker for quality. It's actually not my main priority. I think it can be a little limiting, basically. So it's not my main thing, although I do like it. I am a bit of a sucker where it's like, well, it's really well made, and that does draw my ear. But for me to kind of relate to it, sometimes it doesn't take that much innovation or something that's very innovative to sort of turn my feeling and feel positive about it in that way. Like, okay, something about this is opening up some new territory. So it can be surprisingly little, like, for instance, I know this guy, Brian Carpenter, and from Boston, I record some of his records. Ghost Train Orchestra, I recorded some of that. And it's funny because it's literally trying to do 20s jazz, but they'll be like in there, and this guy, Brandon Seabrook is his name, actually playing distorted banjo and just like these noisy, amazing. He's also very skilled, so the quality's there's also quality. And then he takes these distorted banjo parts, sometimes going into solos, and so that's kind of seamlessly really built into it, and that makes a huge difference for me. Also, it shows context, because you put that in another context, a sort of distorted banjo and some noise solo on a acoustic banjo, it might seem like not that ear catching, because that other context might already be experimental already, but you put it in a sort of thing that in every other way sounds like traditional 20s jazz, and suddenly you're like, oh wow, and it does feel like a new invention.
Yeah.
Just like the Dresden Dolls, I thought, when I recorded them, very Weimar cabaret. They even did like Kurt Weill covers, and actually it's funny because a lot of younger people I talked to thought it was like amazingly original. And it was funny, I always found that surprising because I didn't find it amazingly original. It wasn't that original. I thought it was very, derivative of certain things, but I also really valued the certain injecting
Sure, yeah.
certain amount of experimentalism and innovation in terms of vocals, lyrics, vocal sounds, extra percussion, use of samples. Actually, we did have like scrap metal overdubs on that record. So then again, also showing is that sometimes innovation can be using these tools, pre-existing things in new context. So, but yes, it's still hard, it's elusive to make something that feels completely new at this time.
Sure.
At this time, whereas maybe, so you're right in there, whoever that person quoted is kind of right, where maybe if you want to check off the boxes of what was innovative in the sounds, maybe there was more in some music in freaking 1980 and late 70s. And now I'm like whittling it down, where I'm like saying, oh, even just a little bit of innovation, even a little bit of something new stuck in there, and maybe relying more on context. Like some aspect of it is familiar, but so yes, it's harder and harder to make originality.
It certainly is, and it's very frustrating, to be honest, because you see it across the board in film and television, music, architecture, which I think it's a great segue to talk a little bit about what's going on in Brooklyn with the development, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so if you could just maybe catch me up a little bit. I know there was a vote yesterday, some news, right?
Yeah, well, it's well, we're really fighting also a messaging war with this, because the opposition is really, I mean, in some ways, I like, for instance, there's this group called Open New York.
Yeah.
Open New York for all, right? And so they're very pro building a lot of this housing, and their messaging is, this is going to make New York more affordable. This brings in some affordability. And I think of that group as sort of the progressive front of the real estate industry in New York. So we're fighting on this other thing where it's really like a giveaway. It costs the city money. People might say to me, oh, but maybe New York City needs the money. No, this rezoning that they're going to do of Brooklyn costs the city. It costs New York State $500 million, and it costs maybe not quite that for taxpayers, but it's the city that has to pick up all the infrastructure developments, all the infrastructure updates that have to happen with 20,000 more toilets moving into this area. There's a lot wrong with this rezoning. Actually, the opposition tries to say to us that we're throwing up anything to see what problematic point we make that will stick. And the reality is, I got to say, is like, I'm so overwhelmed with what's wrong with this that sometimes in my little group called Voice of Gowanus, by the way, we have to, try to like whittle it down to like, okay, well, what are we going to talk about now? Because we can't, like for instance, I was a proponent of trying to get the words. I was like, oh, can we just put the words environmental justice in there? Because I mean, just for me, in terms of the messaging, I thought, the opposition, they just throw in affordable housing, right? So it's hard for any of us, and none of us actually are against affordable housing. So it's hard for anyone. It's hard for anyone to say, well, we're against affordable housing. So that's their like catchphrase. And honestly, I'm like, the thing that's there is an environmental justice issue in this, because a lot of what's proposed for these developments is harmful for the public housing that's already there. So this is the poorest of the poor of New York City. And also, communities of color and Black within this rich area that we are in. And hey, surprise, they get screwed by the rezoning because it increases flooding. They already have intense environmental problems there with the water.
Right.
So this is, and when I say flooding, that's it's not just water. It's
right.
There's toxins, there's all these barely remediated brownfields that leak all kinds of terrible things. I mean, around the canal right now, we have like these little towers that are supposed to send a siren in case there's a discharge of toxic stuff into the atmosphere, and then it sends out a siren. And so this is the kind of stuff. So we're talking about flooding in the public housing.
Gone off? Like you've heard the siren go off?
No, I haven't heard it gone off.
Not yet. They got it.
And they're putting more of them up. At first it was like one or two, and now there's one every few blocks. So it's bad news. So I was thinking, oh, we need to talk more about environmental justice. Like that needs to be, I'd like to see those words in our messaging and flyers and all this stuff, because how can anyone be against environmental justice? And if they ask that question or say that or talk about that, then we can talk about the facts and how also the sort of cherry of this redevelopment of Gowanus, which is also bad for my recording studio, which because I'm in the area. Yeah. But the cherry on this rezoning is a site that's owned by the city where they would build the biggest tower and the poorest people, right? The lowest income, like 15% formerly homeless, for instance, right? That's the only place where you have like the lowest of the low where actually would get a unit. Potentially not that many units, but they can apply, right? That spot, which is the cherry where you can even suggest a social justice angle to this rezoning, is that site. And that site, which is called Public Place, is the worst place in terms of the environmental stuff. Really bad stuff that can't even get cleaned up, that seeps up from 150 feet down with fumes and stuff. Smells bad even right now. So and the EPA, separately from the rezoning, because they're not directly, this federal EPA is not directly involved. They're already like, that's not safe, can't be made safe. So it's really bad news that the city's pushing this through. And that's where the poorest of the poor are going to go. And they're going to put a school because they have to, right? So the city has to build a school there because of all the new tenants, and it's going to be on the ground floor right over and so the cherry on the top is essentially a brownfield that they would be building on, which they've redubbed Gowanus Green.
Oh my God. Which just the unfortunate spelling of Gowanus does not seem right.
Oh my God, yeah.
Gowanus Green. That's what that'll look like.
Yeah. Yeah, it's bad news. And of course it's like the criticism is like, oh, these people like me, for instance, don't want poor people around. It's totally not the case. I don't want a lot. So. It's the opposite case, actually. I don't want droves of rich people. It's more the reality.
Right.
I don't want luxury. Yeah. I don't want luxury retail. I don't want Gucci. I don't want my building forced because of increased taxes, because the rezoning would make the value go up. So increased taxes, and then forced to open like Gucci, like in my building or something. This is the kind of stuff, or getting sold, which is more of a pressing issue, because the rezoning of Gowanus would make the building, the actual development, that would take time to happen, like, over a decade or something like that. But the immediate effect, like I'm the most vulnerable, because the immediate effect is that the price goes up because of the market. So the market that protected me, because I've been basically protected by an industrial zoning. So I'm kind of industrial, right? I make things, I make noise, I'm unpleasant, no one wants to be near me, right? So this is, right? That's what that's why you have these zonings, right? That's why that zoning is here. So it protects me and keeps because I can't compete against that other kind of market, like a residential real estate market, right? So that's why they create this thing. No residential, just industrial. So that protects the studio. You change the zoning, I'm no longer protected. The building could get sold. It's a whole nother.
So you don't own it?
No, I don't know. I rent here.
Still,
and yeah, over all these years, and it's a combination of. It varies. There's a time when I'm very valuable to the building in terms of the rent I pay, which isn't ginormous, but it's, it's kind of a little up there. And there's times when that means a lot. Like now, we have the building has vacancies for the first time in because of the pandemic suddenly. And it's funny, with the pandemic, it's actually the rich people that are leaving, right? So the rich people that can afford better options. The rich people that can actually afford, strangely enough, cheaper options, they'll actually take that and can afford to move. And this says so those people are the ones that are fleeing, right, for something nicer and even cheaper. And someone like me can't afford any of that, so I'm here. So actually, economically, I'm more viable in the building. And then other times, depending on how things seesaw, sometimes they feel like they're doing me a favor, and that's kind of okay too. I can do a favor. They like me. It's a building that's dedicated to the arts at the moment. It was not when I moved here. Like in 1979, when I moved here, it was abandoned and it had different owners. But I got lucky. Is
there a possibility of some sort of landmark status for the building?
Yeah. Well, the outside of the building, right? Because it's a complex of buildings, right? So there's we occupy a corner, and then there's buildings along the edge, right, along this that actually front on the sidewalk, front on the street. And then I'm luckily, a lot of dumb luck in my life. I mean, that's all the desirable area here. I picked the place in the middle of the block. I mean, such dumb luck. So I'm protected from noise from the outside. I do annoy a few people with noise, but it's contained. It does not. I don't bother that many people. Also, since it's the least desirable part of the building has not eyed my part of the building as one they can get a lot of good rent for. And because of it's funny because I've stopped really complaining about repairs too much. I still want some basic maintenance, but I've stopped complaining too much because the building actually my part of the building shows its age, right? It's not really ready to be rented out. So that weirdly enough protects me that it's a little on the edge. So so there's not a lot of incentive for the building to get rid of me. But my point was the crazy stuff. The outside of the building was landmarked. So all the buildings of the building complex that front onto the street, those got landmarked. Even though my part of the building is more historic, not just because of what I've done, but also just the industrial history. There's a huge wheel in my space from the steam engine that used to be here, and it was, so there's actual history there that's a little more important, but that's not what the landmarking was about. It was about appearances, really. So my point is my part of the building wasn't landmarked, which really kind of freaked me out, actually. So everywhere, surprise, everywhere got landmarked except me. And that scared me. It's funny because the building, when they thought that my part of the building might get landmarked, maybe even partly because of the history, the music history, there was a moment there where they were trying to move me out of this part of the building because the landmarking scares the building because it binds them and makes repairs and modifications more expensive. So generally owners don't like landmarking. So there was a moment of fear there with the landmarking where I kind of wanted it, but the building was afraid that I would actually get landmarked, and they would, of course, it would protect me if it happened to my part of the building. But before it happens, I'm vulnerable, right? Because that's their window to before it's official to do stuff, even tear it down,
So what are you planning somewhere for future without Bisi Studios?
No, I have no other ideas for what to do with my life other than what you're seeing. And the studio has a lot of value for the stuff we just talked about. And I've grown into the space where the people that I work with and the people that know about my space care about the things. And I also need a lot of space because that's part of part of the sound, which I've grown into, and it's part of what if you want not to sound too businessy, but that's my customers. That's why they come to me. They're not going to come, who knows, to like a little a little corner, a small space. They need a large space, because it's also specialized in live music at this point. Right. That's what the space is unique for.
So
but by the way,
what can people do to help? What can people do to make sure this place stays open?
Well, at the moment, I got to say, I would appreciate donations to the Voice of Gowanus Legal Fund. Yeah. What's good, and I should say, is that we've been successful. So we actually have the law on our side on a few things, and we've had some successes. So that should speak of the quality of the legal representation we have. Yeah. So on retainer, that we have on retainer, right? So we have lawyers working for us, and the process for the process for approving the rezoning has been stopped by the Supreme Court of New York State. So that's what we accomplished. But we still
that was just yesterday, right?
No, that was that was a week ago.
Okay.
And then yesterday something else happened, which was we won the appeal. So the city appealed the restraining order. So the Supreme Court applied a restraining order on the process, and the city appealed and lost. So that happened yesterday. So I'm just saying, so we got good stuff on our side. But we're actually we got money from the donations. We're now actually in debt, but we need to keep because it's the whole fight about the rezoning is going to continue for about a year. So we could use help, and thanks to anyone who hears this and actually donates.
Yes.
You can find that online, Voice of Gowanus. But yeah, really the basis for putting a hold on the rezoning. One thing was that the city didn't properly inform the neighborhood. They did a little bit, but it was all very cryptic and shady and opaque. Right, it wasn't like what you'd really call a notification, and they and also the whole virtual thing. The whole Zoom public meeting where they've changed the rules, where it's actually the community is more of a observer rather than a participant. Mm-hmm. And the city charter is very clear that these have to be participatory with the community, and there's a lot of people that are very important. In this rezoning, potential victims of this rezoning, that actually, of course, it's the poorest of the poor, right? The people that it's, of course, the Black community and the people that are in the public housing, and there's a woeful lack of internet access, of universal internet access in the public housing. A lot of kids, there's even problems with learning because of remote learning, and they don't necessarily have the a lot of the units in public housing don't have Wi-Fi and don't have they don't have the devices, and also old people. It's funny because my council representative member, he today, unrelated but played right into our hands, tweeted out that 1 in 3 elderly New Yorkers doesn't have Wi-Fi, and that's an outrage. And I'm like, well, that's what we're talking about, because he's for the rezoning, our council rep, and he pretty much handed us the data that reinforces our position.
Right.
Because it plays into the top-down thing. They're kind of taking advantage of having to do things Zoom to get control on the top down, less community involvement and engagement of what would happen with public in-person. That's the point, in-person meetings. And now, since we have the vaccine kind of coming down the pike, where things at least are within sight, and this is this rezoning is massive. It's twice the size of Hudson Yards, which is this massive development in Manhattan on the west side. It's twice that size in terms of the footprint. It's 3 times the luxury units. So it's big and forever and very expensive to the city. So this is something like, it doesn't even quite make sense. It makes sense to wait 6 months to have more, from our point of view. It makes sense to have more community engagement, to wait 6 months till the public meetings can be held post-vaccine. Mm-hmm. Sort of, at least when we're kind of coming out of the pandemic, because it's just way too important. And of course, the city, for a lot of political reasons of their timing, like the term limit that's happening now for our mayor, for de Blasio, right? So that's a rush, right? Because he's in
Yeah.
favor of development. So they're like rushing to push this through. And so actually the state Supreme Court ruled in our favor that there's something there and there should be a hearing. So the hearing happens next week.
What is the end game for Voice of Gowanus? What is it that you want to see happen?
Well, one big thing that we want to see happen is remediation of brownfields, the dredging of the canal. That is all happening. The canal is going to take. It's funny. They originally said the EPA, because it's a Superfund site. So the Gowanus Canal, which is a block from the recording studio, 2 blocks from the recording studio, where I was saying that people are actually concerned about like fumes, discharges from the dredging, right? Because they pull that stuff up and they don't even know what's down there. They originally said that the dredging was going to take 10 years. That's what they said. The EPA itself, official, was 10 years. And now I've noticed it's shifted to at least 10 years, right? So because they don't know and you know how these things happen. If they say 10 years, it could be 15. So basically it's a long time. So basically we'd like to see actual building and certification of specific lots and plans, especially if they're on brownfields or on the edge of the canal, to wait till the dredging is done. That's what we'd like. We at least think that there should be more transparency in sort of the decision making. And we feel that that's not happening. So we want more transparency to, because some of the sewage stuff, because there's like sewage overflow stuff, not to get too wonky here, but the sewage, combined sewage overflow, CSO, right? These CSO tanks, because right now when we get over an inch of rain, that floods into the streets. So a lot of us, for instance, when it's really raining heavily, we don't even use our toilets because we know where that's going. That's going on our neighbors, right? So
man,
it is not. The city doesn't even have an adequate plan for the sewage for the existing population, let alone for an additional 20,000 people. So we want more transparency for lots, particularly that are on the edge of the canal, and what's that going to do, and also how it's going to affect how that development would affect because of hydrology. They don't want to do a hydrology impact, hydrology report. That's been asked for a district. That hasn't happened. How that's going to affect the public housing, which is kind of a big deal. We at this point think that the data is there for actually just not building on that brownfield that I mentioned before, Gowanus Green, quote unquote, where they're going to put the poorest, formerly homeless, and that's their cherry on the cake in terms of some social justice out of this. And we actually think that's the wrong place for that size. Definitely the wrong place for a school. We think the data is there for that, but at least that should be looked at a little more vigorously. So that's one thing we would want. So that's why we're rarely concerned about discussion in this process and want it halted until it can just be done right and vigorously, where the community can be there in person. Just to say that the argument, which it is true that a lot of these virtual meetings that have happened with the neighborhood, like with our community board, more people do log in, but that doesn't ask who is logging in. That would be a question. And what kind of engagement, quantity versus quality. So who is really engaged in that, and do they even watch? Or I know with music, I'm aware of that. It's like, wow, I do a little thing, put it on virtual. I get a lot more people looking at it than I can drag to a show. But I don't know. Do they watch the whole thing? Do they really engage? Do they care? Do they have the volume down? Is it a mistake? I mean, I don't know. It's not clear.
Yeah, I think about that with the podcast as well, right? You don't know. I mean, I can give you numbers, but you don't know who's really listening, how many, all that stuff. But this is one of those situations, where when I was watching the documentary, I saw you go into the Whole Foods, right? And it's like, that's where it all starts, doesn't it? I mean, it happens in Denver. I mean, we're dealing with the same kind of stuff. I mean, South Park has made fun of it. I mean, it's like, that's where it all starts. It starts with the Whole Foods, and then everything goes to hell. So it kind of makes you wonder, like, what is it about Whole Foods that's just fucking everything up? And are we cranky people because we are resisting change? I would argue that I'm resisting homogenization. I don't like everything to look the same. I'm also aesthetically drawn to, crummy looking places. I like industrial areas.
Well, that's one thing that's kind of funny in all this. I mean, the rezoning is so complicated, but a lot of this new development is flat out ugly. It's just, it's actually, I don't want to focus too much on it, because actually the people that are pro-development love harping that we're just worried about aesthetics, you know.
Exactly,
But it's aesthetically indefensible. It's awful. I mean, I would actually tell you that I think that human beings, what human beings make generally is not necessarily that attractive to our senses, and only becomes so with age, right? So you can just go to Europe, right? And go to like the places that are amazing, or like medieval parts of town or old parts of town, you know, and because they're falling apart a little. And then you go to Amsterdam and all the buildings are kind of crooked and they got to be propped up, and then it's old and kind of decrepit. That's when it's like beautiful. You know what I mean? So this whole thing of age, I know we all like to be young, but this whole thing of that applying to like buildings, I don't know. I mean, safety aside, I like things being safe. But on the other hand, it's like these glass towers. Who the hell thinks that that's beautiful, you know, or nice? But that's aside from, that's maybe not the main point.
It's hard to
but
fight that,
it's in there that, and it's not a nothing. It is sort of important, because the preserving something about the neighborhoods. I mean, imagine people looking back in 100 years and just seeing, wow, New Yorkers really fucked themselves, you know, really just gutted their own city when there was so much there and so much that's interesting. And people already say that about some of the land use choices we've made in the last century, you know, that, like, for instance, in Manhattan, where the Port Authority is, the Penn Station, right? Pennsylvania Station, the main train station in Midtown Manhattan, where Madison Square Garden is as well, right next to it. That used to be like some gorgeous building that people still, with tears in their eyes, that was destroyed and over some like garbage. I mean, what's there now is, it's basically just garbage. It's some new, like, it's like a train terminal. It's like whatever. It's nothing. But I don't think we're being, what was the point? We're being kind of grumpy about.
Maybe. Yes, grumpy, maybe.
Well, there are real, I mean, here's the thing, because it comes up occasionally when someone says, I mean, someone might even say this to me as sort of encouragement. They go, well, you know, sometimes change is good. Someone tries to say that to me. Usually when someone says that in a friendly way, I thank them for the positive thoughts. But really, I think that the argument of like New York has to change and it's always been about change. And, you know, I might have said that until I got more informed. And then I was like, well, who's driving this change? And change under whose, a lot of it has to do with power and money. And so is greed? Why would I get behind change that's motivated by greed? Why would I get motivated by change top down? I'm all about change. I mean, you could say that the scale of what people might accomplish for change in Gowanus is smaller than 30-story buildings, but that's just size. You know, I would argue that that's not really change, because what happens necessarily, certainly the luxury component of this, is that change that means anything. You know, already I can point to meaning and change that's happened in Gowanus driven just from this recording studio. And it means a lot to, you know, a sizable amount of people. Maybe not millions of people are aware of the change from music that was been recorded here, but it's, you know, it's not nothing. So I'm all for change and action. And life is about action. Yeah, but action of like building these luxury towers, is that the and financial action, is that the action we want? Because that's also their argument, that they love saying that there's no economic activity. I mean, the time, I think would be a little much to say, because it's not part of their narrative. It's not part of their narrative that Gowanus is blighted. They like saying it's rich, which is, on the other side, it's actually not completely rich. I'm not rich. I'm not a landowner. You know, I'm not an owner. But the whole idea, but they've said that versus the development in downtown Brooklyn, which was the Barclays Center Stadium, right? That was a scandal, because that was eminent domain. They actually took land from private owners. Some resisted, some got paid off, land from public owners, and gave it to other private owners and private developers. And that's illegal, eminent domain. It's illegal to, and that went all the way up to like the district court, federal court, that argument. That's illegal to go from private to private. I mean, private to public is one thing, because you're putting a fire station into a school or a post office. Okay, that's one thing, but not private to private. That's illegal, unconstitutional.
Jesus.
And so it was Ratner, that was the developer. What Ratner had to how the way he had to justify this was that it was blighted, and that was the thing, that the city was trying to do everything possible to unblight, and it was so hopeless. It was such a hopeless situation that the only way you could possibly do it, recover economically, get some economic activity in there, was to give that land to a private developer, or else, because they tried and everything's just going downhill. And so that was clearly, no one who actually lives around here would think that, right? So I think the district court was in like Connecticut or something, and they won, unfortunately. But that's what the argument that they had to make, that it was blighted. And again, always, and for a while that was said about Gowanus, how like just blind to the fact that there was economic activity at all. Like, it's just, there's nothing, we have to do something. There's nothing going, I'm like, I'm something. I'm economic. I'm economic activity.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, you just feel so insignificant, I guess, in these fights, but you've thrown yourself fully into it, for sure.
Well, I got to say, because I contributed an affidavit to the I contributed an affidavit to the lawsuit, which, like I said, went to the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, and when they granted the restraining order on the ULURP, and then my affidavit in there, it's weird. It was funny, this rare feeling of feeling like a winner. And which is rare. Like, I was like, wow, I actually feel, because I feel like very invisible, whether it's in terms of the city. I feel like I'm always getting shit on, ignored, undervalued, whether it's the police or the zoning or the community board. It's like, who's this scumbag, basically, right? So that's how I feel. And I felt like, wow, it's weird. I feel like I'm like a winner. Like I should feel more like that. And yes, sometimes I do, but at that moment when we won at the Supreme Court, that's how I felt. But by the way, I think with the thing with the Whole Foods ruining everything was it was part of the rebranding of the neighborhood. It was part of, and people suddenly, it's amazing how this is, of course, pre-Amazon, before it got bought by Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
The messaging to New York City and beyond was that Gowanus is a place that has lifestyle. So it was a sort of lifestyle rebranding where people could have their like dinner parties in their like new developments with like that has a balcony, and they could have, they could have their lobster tails and stuff like that, and they're not worried about the high prices. So it's a life. I thought it was a lifestyle rebranding of this area, which I guess at this point happened like 9 years ago. And it's funny, it really was an important part of what set the stage for this rezoning, because obviously a big part of this rezoning is that the neighborhood has to be attractive to rich people, which is another thing that seems so odd, because right now, is it really attractive to rich people? Rich people are leaving, right? So so even from their argument, where it provides affordability for people of lesser means, the reality is it's dependent on rich people, because this money's got to come from somewhere to build all this stuff, right? So it's reliant on rich people. So if rich people come here and there's nothing, and restaurants are closed right now in this pandemic, and someone like me is gone, so there's not even the thing of like, oh, it's edgy, it's quirky, then what is there? But so Whole Foods is a part of that, making it safe for rich people. They actually changed the name, talking about Gowanus being an unfortunate name. It was going to be Whole Foods Gowanus, and then they realized that was problematic, because all you have to do is Google Gowanus and Superfund, toxic site, most polluted waterway in North America, and all that stuff comes up. So they changed it to Third and Third. So, but that was the sort of rebranding, and that as soon as it just being there, that increased the property value of my building, and the taxes went up just from it open. As soon as it opens, taxes went up.
Do you worry about your own health living so close to some of these toxic vapors?
Yeah, it comes up, because I know that there has been. I also feel like, I just can't worry about it, and maybe if I'm still okay and I haven't gotten any kind of chronic illness, that maybe it's I've passed that threshold and I'm okay. I'm also like a good 2 blocks from it. But for instance, during some of the hurricanes, actually, oddly enough, Hurricane Sandy, well, Superstorm Sandy, it flooded the area, but fell short of my building. but it was there, visible from my rooftop. There was a whole lake, right where Whole Foods was just being built. There was a lake. There was 6 feet of water, with waves. You could see waves in the hurricane in the site right across the street. It was incredible. We called it like a whole lake or something for a little while, Whole Foods Lake. And that lasted for a couple of days, just sitting there and then transmitting all the crap that was under, because that where Whole Foods is underneath it is very toxic. Yeah, there was a big problem.
That's fitting.
There was a big problem. But for instance, Hurricane Irene, which was a year before Hurricane Sandy, that one was actually pretty bad for my building, weirdly enough, because it had more rainfall than Sandy. Sandy was all about the storm surge, and Irene, which is like the year before, had a lot of rain, had like 6 inches of rain or something. And yeah, my whole basement underneath me got flooded. I was good, but with the area that underneath me floods kind of anyway, because it's actually part of a primal waterway. That's actually a part. It has a name, it's like a Mill House Brook or something. So actually I have like a primordial waterway that's under the building. Then that flooded and went flooded by like 6 feet. And so that clearly was stuff taken. So it's moving all those toxins around. That was unhealthy. So not great. I'm slightly concerned, but I think I'm just.
But so far you're all right.
Sometimes okay, and that's also why I joke sometimes about being a mutant. So, which people like when I call myself a mutant. I'm like, oh, okay. People say you should make a T-shirt. So, but yeah, so the mutant thing comes up.
Wow, Martin, that's incredible. How do you keep this sunshiny disposition? Are you an optimist?
That's a good question. I kind of was not. I was cautious. I go between being an optimist to being a cautious optimist. So I must say that during the Trump era, I was a cautious optimist, and now I'm more as an The problem with optimism with this is sometimes the good stuff comes. The good stuff might also be bad for me, So I manage. So basically, even the stuff that's bad for me, that seems kind of good for everyone else, then I just try to like up it and keep the positive things on my side that I can feel good about. So for instance, for instance, the arts are getting gentrified, so the more we work on arts and more we work on that branding on my end, which is which I feel maybe I've contributed to, that there's arts in Gowanus.
For sure.
Well, guess who the new artists are that are coming in? It's people with like art degrees from expensive universities, from RISD or freaking Brown or something. So then and so that's actually has made my rent go up. So even though that seems like it's a positive thing that I'm a part of, it's sort of so it's funny because as you support the arts in Gowanus, you're also supporting something that maybe, do I fit into that? Am I even the arts? That's what I wonder about. Sometimes I wonder if music, particularly rock and roll based music, is even considered the arts. I will actually say it's not. That's not what people mean when they say supporting the arts or the arts. They mean paintings. They're not talking about rock bands.
But it's culturally significant in a huge way, right? For us Americans, rock and roll. I mean,
absolutely. You know what really strikes me, going a little tangent here, but it struck me the other day when I saw something I actually did not really quite agree with in Nashville, how it's illegal against the city charter or whatever to have like a commercial home recording studio on your property in your house, right? So you basically home recording studio illegal in Nashville. And I was like, okay, I'm not down with that. But the fact that they're even considering the importance of music in their city, I was like, wow, that's amazing. Can you imagine? We're at New York, which is as significant as Nashville. I mean, we're like the northern component of like Detroit is, right? It's like, you have Memphis and Nashville. That's like Stax Records, right? That's the southern component of American music. And then you have the north with Motown, and then New York City, Sugar Hill Records or whatever. New York is important in music, crucial in music.
Very.
Right? If a crucial point for jazz, right? There's New Orleans and basically Harlem, New York, and hip hop, punk also. So New York is very important, and postmodernism, are all kinds of stuff. And but yet it really doesn't get talked about until we're in a crisis. I did like the fact that it was even talked about at all with the pandemic, where people said, well, the culture is it's destroying some of the culture because of these. They talked about restaurants, which is fine, their culture too.
Right.
But so I was a little encouraged. It's like, oh, they are at least considering the sort of social fabric underlying the economy. So I felt a little, they didn't talk about recording studios, but but anyway, compared to Nashville, it's funny how like some places do take their music more seriously.
Yeah. Do you spend a lot of time on sound or music theory? Do you read a lot of this stuff, or is it just from doing it?
I should say it's just from doing it, but I've dabbled a little bit and read and tried to train myself a little bit. So there's some of that happened. Also, maybe some of what I've done is a reminder, because I got a bit of a music education as a kid, which I unfortunately, I guess, rebelled against and sort of forgot a lot of it. But my mom had me, take piano lessons, and when that didn't work, violin lessons. And she also, she was a concert pianist, and she toured a lot and stuff. And then when I was a child, she took time off from that, and actually, because she had spent she was a prodigy, so she spent a lot of her young years on tour rather than college, and she regretted that. So she went to music school to try to get a degree or something like that. And so I would accompany her. So I actually went, sometimes I would accompany her. So I went to some classes with her as a toddler, which I remember in music school in Manhattan. I guess I would be in the late 60s. Tons of hippies. It's kind of amazing. Yeah. And so I think I got a little bit of that, and my mom would talk about it. So there's some of that I feel like some of the stuff is familiar when I hear talk or read about music theory, but I'm really like a novice. But there's something there, but it's mostly sort of self-taught or just finding my own way.
Does your Argentinian heritage ever factor into, anything? Anything you do?
It did on my first few records. Like my first record was called Creole Mass, which came out, I guess, in '88, something like that. And then I did a few records where I sang a lot in Spanish. And also, that was at a strange time when I actually cared about my identity and thought it was interesting and thought there was something there for me to think about. And as I grew older, I kind of realized, it's funny now because everyone's talking about identity, but then at a certain point, as I grew older, I felt like it doesn't say anything about me. And it's if I want to really think about myself, it's just scratching the surface identity, or like that I come from a South American background and what that culture is like, because I didn't grow up immersed in that culture, but it has had an influence. So maybe even capturing some of that influence and bring it into what I do is something that happened in those first records of mine. I also had an EP called Sia in Tijuana. So I was, with some Spanish language songs. So I kind of went there, but then kind of really felt that was cutting myself a little short, because that's not really me. That's that's a context and a background, and I'm not even in that context anymore. I don't live in South America for that matter. And so I think that had an influence on my ear, as everything does. And also a lot of the like folklore of Argentina does have very existential kind of things in it. This guy called Atahualpa Yupanqui, some of his, it's just nylon acoustic guitar, but some of the stuff he sings about is also very confrontational to Catholicism, which is kind of interesting. Like it'll be stuff like, don't give me any crosses. I don't want any crosses on my tombstone. I mean, all this kind of stuff that seems like more about like sort of like an earth religion or whatever, even though it's not like he's indigenous, and it's not animism, but in a way it's connected. There seems to be some connection to that, like a spiritual value of like, hearing a wildcat, out in the wilderness. So all that had a certain healthy escapism to me, because I listened to that in my late teens and early 20s, and sort of was a bit of a spiritual guide to get away from this modern world, which I just don't love. So I just don't love it. It's useful, and I like figuring out ways to use it, because I still like I like people. I'm not a misanthrope, but the actual world, kind of whatever. I don't even love gear. I think it's funny when people fetishize gear, and I'm like, yes, I get it. I fetishize it a little, but I'm not going to take that home. I'm not going to be like cuddling it or anything. It's gear.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
So I don't love any of that. So when I saw this, like for instance with that Argentinian artist, and I listened to his recordings, and there was like sort of an earth-based spiritualism to it that was sort of escape in a way, and I was like, oh yeah, the power, because we talk about that stuff, the power of like a mountain lion, at night in the friggin' Andes, was sort of like, oh. And so that was a bit of the escape, which was powerful, which I do try to bring into the music. I mean, there is a bit of a, I'm not that urban in what I do, although I think is a big component in that. Though there is a sort of, I would have to say almost quasi-spiritual thing. There's a sort of escape to it, which is sort of universal rather than like, I mean, I like both things rather than like, Grandmaster Flash.
Of course.
And here we are like on a stoop in Bed-Stuyvesant.
Do you ever wonder what would have happened had your parents not passed away when you were so young?
Yeah, well, one thing, I don't feel great about it, but one thing is I probably would have ended up going to college.
Mm-hmm.
They probably would have insisted. I didn't know where my path was leading. I probably would have been like, oh, okay, I guess. And they would have funded it. And I think maybe I wouldn't have had this path,
right.
Because again, dumb luck, a lot of dumb luck with me. I don't like saying I had some kind of excellent vision. It just was like, I think I must look back and think, I guess I had some pretty good instincts, and I called a spade a spade. When I saw that there's stuff happening in New York, the thing is, I really thought like in 80 with the people I was involved in, I had this weird feeling by my standards that it was one of the most important things happening on the planet at that moment. Not that I was important, but I just felt like that community, that grouping, that the people around me. I didn't totally tag it as just being New York, but maybe a little bit. Like I kind of felt like I definitely bought into the idea that New York was a world capital in terms of culture, a world cultural capital.
And just right place at right time for sure.
Yeah. Can you still see me? Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So then one last question then too, so we kind of tie everything together. There's a couple names I want to throw out at you because there's so much literature. So I don't like to be that guy that says, do you remember when, or do you remember when you worked with so-and-so, et cetera, et cetera. But I have to ask about two mainstream names or more mainstream names, Whitney Houston and Ginger Baker. Just any thoughts? What comes to mind about those two?
Yeah, well, do you mind if I grab something to plug my phone in?
No, not at all, please.
A little break? 2 seconds.
Yeah.
2 seconds.
Yeah.
Sorry, I got paranoid.
Not at all. Not at all. I appreciate the extra time. I know we're past time for you.
All right, I believe I am good. Whitney Houston, the reality, which I should point out, is that she didn't come here. So basically, what was recorded here was the basic tracks, if you will, and some of the overdubs. So basically, the music, the instruments were recorded in this studio, and then she sang over them. It's also good to remember that she was a teenager then, 17 years old. She had her mom was a big soul star, like on a major label. That's how it happened. Good pals. Her mom was good pals with the owner of the label, and which was like Elektra or something like that.
Yeah.
And so that's how that. It was sort of a favor. It was sort of like, it wasn't really like a. The song itself was kind of interesting because it was written. The first performance of that song was by the Soft Machine, which was a sort of psychedelic UK band, like all hippie stuff, and with Robert Wyatt, who was also sang it. I think he sang it, or he did his own version. So there was this real like psychedelic 60s background, which is really amazing when you think of having Whitney Houston. That's anathema almost to that. Glamorous pop star versus, flower power or something, and it was sort of amazing that she would be on it. But that was the inspiration for doing that song, which is very powerful. And for some reason, it ended up being sort of a polished version with like really actually good piano on it, and Archie Shepp on saxophone. So it's like a real like jazz person that's supposedly not me, but some of the other people in the Material Collective just saw him on the street and literally said, "There's Archie Shepp walking down the street." That's the old days when people didn't put up boundaries like they do now. And not like, "Oh, did you recognize me from my Instagram?" And they just went up to him and said, "Would you come play? We'll pay you for the transportation or something." And then he came and performed the saxophone on that. So anyway, Whitney Houston's performance on that song had to be called Memories, had to be done in Manhattan, and I wasn't there. So that's the limited relationship. Ginger Baker, on the other hand, did come here, and there's some photos in what now is my bathroom, because the bathroom was pretty intense. It had really tall ceilings and stuff, so it was like a stone room. But Bill Laswell liked that. It was like a stone room that sounded kind of like what they used to say John Bonham used to record in. So it had that kind of sound. And Ginger Baker, he played over like we prepared what would be like a complex click track, which I'm not even sure that's the best idea, but we gave him that, and because it leads him too much in a way. That was my fear, that if you make if you make it too elaborate, the click track, it suggests to the drummer what they should play rather than just kind of playing in time and then doing whatever they're going to do. But he did that. And then actually at some point, that one of those recordings where we were using that approach, and it was kind of a world vibe. We went in a world direction with like bouzouki, like a Greek instrument, and oud, this kind of stuff. And that ended up being a solo record. So that's a Ginger Baker solo record, which for some reason now is just, the title is fucking flying out of my brain. But that's it. He was an affable bully. He was sort of like one of these people that, was so funny and so humorous about him being an old codger grump that I don't know. Maybe he wasn't a bully. I guess he wasn't a bully. But, like he would be like screaming at me like half the time. At this point, I'm like, because I also have kind of a thick skin. Like
after the people you've worked with in this business.
Sometimes I need to remind myself. I'm a little open for abuse, but so I try to watch it. I got to learn, like I have to analyze. Is that really correct? Like I have to, in hindsight, at the moment I can shut that stuff down and be like, okay, whatever. Just let's get the drum tracks done. And so, he'd be yelling at me that I went too far back. Like he would, because I'd be like, I'll just go back 4 bars, and you come in, and he'd be like. And specifically, the line was, "Martin, you don't understand. These are very complicated rhythms." That's a quote. And then I was like, okay, like you want me to go back a minute or something? And then we'd go and then we'd blow the punch, right? Because it was back in 2 minutes, either he'd fuck up or I'd fuck up. And then he'd get really annoyed. Okay, just go back 4 bars. And then Bill Laswell's like, oh, that's what he's been saying. Just figure out the 4 bars. Rather than fucking all this time going back a minute and wasting half an hour. So he was a bit of a bully. And then the thing that was really kind of great was, I guess this will be my last anecdote about him, was it was one of those days, everyone's coming with Ginger. Bill Laswell's coming from Manhattan in a cab with Ginger. I'm waiting, 2:00 arrival. It's 3:00. 3:00 turns to 4:00, turns to 4:30. It was really at that point, it's hard to communicate. I'm like, well, I guess there's a limit, right? I guess there's a point where they're not coming and I should just leave, right? So it was really freaking getting late. So it was just about like, I guess I'd call 2 hours is reasonable. Just call it. What can I do? No call. So then I hear the knock on the door, and it's Ginger. And then he like looks up at me from the door, because the door, I look down, he goes, "Where the fuck have you been?" So that's what I mean. Is that he's sort of an affable bully, and he makes fun of himself, self-effacing. So some people get a pass on that, right? They can be bullies and then just
they sure do.
It's fun. It's funny because they have a good sense of humor. But he does that, kind of appreciate it. So I like Ginger, and I learned a lot from him and respect him.
That's awesome, Martin. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Billy. Ex nihilo. Talk to